Montana Territory, 1879. The wind was cold enough to sting, but the blood running through Vance Steller's veins burned hotter than a branding iron. He pulled his duster tighter across his chest and stared down the poker table inside the Dry Creek Saloon. The stench of whiskey and sweat clung to the walls, same as it always did, but tonight, something was different. Tonight, he was about to bet every acre of his ranch, 1,800 acres north of the Bitterroot Mountains. Every fence post, every steer, every inch of soil his father had left behind. "I will match your wager," Vance said, voice level but tight. He laid down the deed to the Steller ranch, folded crisp, his name scrawled in ink across the top. "You win, you get it all." Across from him, Clay Reddin's sneer deepened. His gold tooth flashed in the lamplight. "You sure you want to do that, cowboy? All that land for a woman who ain't even yours?" "She ain't yours either," Vance said. "And she ain't for sale. But I know you're holding her somewhere. You win, you get the ranch. I win, you tell me where she is. And you never go near her again." Clay's grin widened. He liked games, especially ones with blood on the line. "Then let's play." It started 3 weeks earlier. Vance had been hauling lumber down from the high ridge when he saw smoke rising near Crow Ridge. He rode out, expecting a wildfire. What he found instead was a broken wagon, 2 dead horses, and a woman tied to a post, her mouth bloody from the gag she had bitten through. Her name was Pruitt Gellar. He had not known her, but he had taken her in, cared for her wounds, and listened when she could finally speak. She had been taken by Clay's men, pulled from a stagecoach headed toward Helena. They had sold the others. She was kept for some reason Vance did not want to think about too hard. He had gotten her safe back to his ranch. She stayed in the loft of the barn for nearly a week, barely speaking, barely eating. Then one night she vanished. Vance tracked her to the edge of the ridge but found only broken brush and Clay Reddin's boot prints. Now, 2 weeks later, she was somewhere behind locked doors again, and Vance had nothing left to offer but his land. The game was brutal. Cards slapped, tempers snapped. Sweat trickled down Vance's neck as he studied every twitch of Clay's jaw, every flick of his fingers. The saloon was dead quiet now, even the piano had gone still. Vance laid his final hand down. 4 kings. Clay cursed, slammed his cards down 3 aces. Vance said nothing at first. He just reached across the table, grabbed the paper deed, and folded it back into his coat. "Where is she?" Clay spit on the floor. "Old Shank Mine, West Slope past the gulch. She's probably already dead by now." Vance did not waste a second. He rode through the night, snow biting at his face. Lantern lights swung from his saddle horn. The trail was rough, but he knew it by heart. His father had mined that slope before it dried up. The place had not seen a soul in years. He found her before dawn. She was tied to a beam inside the collapsed shaft, her wrists raw, her blouse torn, but her eyes lit up the second she saw him. "Vance," she whispered, voice hoarse. "You came." He dropped to his knees and cut her free with a hunting knife. She fell against his chest, shaking. "I told you I would," he said, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. She gripped his coat, her fingers clawing for something solid. I thought he'd kill me. Not while I'm breathing." They did not talk much on the ride back. She rode up front, holding the reins with shaking hands while he walked beside the horse, keeping a hand on her leg so she knew he was there. Back at the ranch, she slept for almost 2 days. Vance stayed close, cleaning out her wounds, feeding her broth with a spoon, brushing her hair when it tangled. And slowly, she came back. One morning, she stepped outside into the snow, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and said, "You gave up your ranch for me." He nodded. "You are worth more than land." She looked at him, really looked. "No one ever said that to me before." "Well, they should have." She stepped closer. "You lost everything?" "I did not lose you." She pressed her forehead against his chest. "You barely know me." "I know enough," he said. "I know you are brave. I know you fight. I know you are good." Her fingers curled into his shirt. "I feel safe here." Then softer. "I feel safe with you." Vance held her tight, his chest rising and falling with hers, and for the first time in years he felt like the world had stopped spinning. He kissed her then, slow and sure, out in the quiet snow, the mountains watching like old friends. And she kissed him back, like she had been waiting her whole life for that moment. The snow had melted in patches by the time Pruitt began walking the ridge trails alone, favoring the sunlit edge of the bluff where the wind rolled soft and low. Vance watched from the fence-line, one gloved hand resting on the cedar post he'd meant to mend. She moved slow but steady now, her coat cinched tight, boots scuffing earth instead of snow. Her hair was cleaner, tied back with a strip of muslin she'd found in the pantry. She still looked over her shoulder sometimes, but not as often. He didn't follow her. She'd told him once she needed to feel her own feet under her again, and he'd understood. That evening, she came back with a bundle of sage and dry pine needles in her apron. "I want to burn it in the hearth," she said, standing in the open barn doorway. "Not for spirits or ghosts, I just want the smoke to smell like something besides fear." Vance didn't ask where she'd learned that. He only stepped aside and nodded toward the house. Inside, she built the fire herself, crouched low and careful, her fingers steady as they fed in the dry needles. The smoke curled up sweet and sharp, and she leaned back on her heels, eyes closed. "I used to do this for my brother," she said, not looking at him. "After he came back from fighting in the valley, he'd sit on the porch and shake like a leaf. Mama said to hush, but I just light a bit of pine and let it burn. Didn't fix him, but it gave him something else to breathe." Vance sat down across from her but stayed quiet. She looked up after a while. "You ever lose someone like that?" He nodded once. "My older cousin Wade. Drowned in the Yellowstone trying to save a mule. I was 16. First time I ever saw a man's face go still." Pruitt let the silence settle between them, and then she said, "I don't remember what calm feels like. I'm trying, but it's like I'm waiting for the next knock on the door." "There won't be one here," he said. "I don't let trouble get past the gate." She tilted her head. "You always live like that, just hold the line and hope nothing breaks through. Used to be I lived for the land. Now I live for what's on it." Pruitt stood and walked over to the window. "There's something I need to ask you," she said finally. "Why didn't you walk away? After I left the barn, you could have just let it be, sold the ranch, started fresh somewhere else." Vance rose too, slow and deliberate. "Because I don't walk away from people who look me in the eye and stay. You didn't owe me anything, but you stayed that week. You didn't run until you thought you had to." "I should have told you," she said, voice low. "I thought I could make it to Helena and disappear. I thought I'd spare you the trouble." "You're not trouble." She turned then, and something in her face had shifted, less guarded, more tired. "I ain't good at being still," she said. "I've been running since I was 16, and I don't know how to be kept." "I'm not keeping you," Vance replied. "You decide if you stay. But if you do, it's not out of debt." Later that night, she came down from the loft with her bedroll tucked under one arm. She stood at the threshold of the spare room and looked at him, where he sat by the kitchen stove sharpening a blade. "I can't sleep with the roof sloping like that. Makes me feel caged." He nodded and motioned toward the cot. "Door swings both ways. You can leave it open if that helps." She smiled, small and real. "I think I will." The next morning, she was already up when he came in from the pasture, coffee boiled and eggs cooked with a pinch of dried onions she'd found in the cellar. "I was thinking," she said, handing him a tin plate, "I can sew better than most, and I remember enough sums to help with your ledgers if you want help." "I'd want that," he said, accepting the plate, "if it's what you want too." "I want to earn my place here, not just hide in it," he nodded. "Then you're already part of this." There was no ceremony, no declaration, just the quiet settling of two lives beginning to lean against each other. And that was enough, for now, by late March, the thaw reached the valley floor. The river at the edge of the eastern pasture swelled with meltwater, and the cattle grew restless with the scent of open grass. Vance spent most of the daylight hours mending the south fence, where a pair of steers had broken through the week before. Pruitt took to riding the perimeter with him, her seat still cautious in the saddle, but growing surer with each mile. They didn't speak much while they rode. She preferred the quiet in the morning, and Vance had learned to let the stillness stretch. But that afternoon, as they paused at the ridge above the gulch, she drew her horse alongside his and said, "I saw a shape in my dreams last night. A woman with hair like mine standing in water up to her waist. She had a rifle across her back." Vance kept his eyes on the horizon. "You think it was memory?" "No, I think it was something I need to become." She turned in the saddle and looked at him directly. "Do you believe people can change what they're made of or just how they carry it?" He adjusted the brim of his hat against the glare. "I think what's in you stays in you, but sometimes it softens or hardens. Depends on how the world treats it." She nodded once, then nudged her horse forward down the slope. That evening she asked if she could keep one of the rifles in the barn. "You know how to shoot?" he asked, setting down the whetstone he'd been using. "Well enough. My uncle taught me to shoot to warn off coyotes. I never aimed at anything bigger." He studied her a moment, then rose and walked to the cabinet by the back door. "Take the Winchester. It's light and it won't jam in weather." She ran her hand over the polished stock. "I'll keep it clean." "I trust you will." Weeks passed, and the rhythm of their days settled into something unspoken but sure. She took over the correspondence with the feed supplier in Missoula, using the tidy script she'd once used to copy hymnals in her mother's parlor. He let her. She organized the ledger without being asked, stacked the jars in the root cellar by season, and rewound the clock in the parlor every Sunday at dusk. One evening, she came in from the creek with a bundle of willow twigs and a small netted sack of river mussels. "You ever eat these?" she asked, already rinsing them in the wash basin. "Can't say I have. They're plain, but if you boil them with vinegar and onion, they taste like they belonged here all along." She cooked them over the stove in a dented tin pot. He watched her work until the steam filled the kitchen. "I've been thinking about staying on," she said as she ladled the mussels into a bowl. "Not just for spring, for good." He set down his fork. "You sure that's what you want?" "I've never had a reason to stay anywhere past the first thaw. But here, when I wake up, I don't flinch. I don't wait for the door to break open. That has to count for something." He reached across the table, not to touch her, but to steady the bowl she'd nudged too close to the edge. "It counts for everything." That night, she brought a folded piece of paper into the parlor and held it out to him. "My name was never mine, not really. Pruitt Gellar was something I took from a grave marker in Kansas City. The real me was born Ruth Ellen Mabry. I figured if I'm staying, you ought to know that." He took the paper and read it without speaking, then he set it down on the table. "I don't care what name you wore before. You're Ruth to me now, if that's who you are." She sat beside him on the settee, her hands folded in her lap. "I'm tired of hiding pieces of myself. I want to be whole again, and I want to be that with you." He slid his hand over hers, waited until she turned her palm to meet his. "Then let's build something that don't have corners to hide in." She leaned her head to his shoulder and he rested his cheek in her hair. The fire crackled low in the hearth. Outside, the coyotes yipped in the distance, but the house stood quiet, warm, and unbothered. The first real heat settled in by mid-May, creeping into the wood grain of the floorboards and softening the soil beneath the corral. The cottonwoods leafed out in thick clusters along the creek. Vance had taken to removing his hat when he walked in from the fields, letting the sweat dry under his hairline before he crossed the porch. Ruth had started sleeping with the windows open, the breeze carrying in the scent of wild mint from the creek banks. That morning, she was on her knees in the garden, sleeves rolled to the elbow, pressing tiny rows of carrot seed into furrows she'd lined with the edge of her palm. He watched her from the shade of the barn, one shoulder propped against the doorframe. "You always plant with your hands?" he asked, stepping down into the dirt. She didn't look up. "Only way I trust it. If the seeds fall wrong, the roots twist." He crouched beside her, brow furrowed. "You ever done this before?" My mother kept a plot behind the boarding house. She said food you grow with your own hands won't turn on you. She dusted her palms against her apron and sat back on her heels. "I didn't believe it then. I do now." He nodded toward the shallow trench. "You think it'll take, if the soil's good and the sun holds steady." "It's got a chance." He looked at her, dirt smudged across her cheek, hair sticking to her temple, and thought she was the surest thing he'd ever wagered on. That afternoon, Ruth took the wagon into town for laundry soap and kerosene. When she returned, her expression was unreadable, her hands tight on the reins even after the horses had stopped. "Two men were asking after you at the mercantile," she said as she stepped down. "Didn't give names. One had a scar like a burn across his left cheek. Said they heard about a man who played high-stake games in Dry Creek and wanted to see if he was still feeling lucky." Vance unhitched the team and led them to water. Clay Redden had a hand of men, some scattered after the game. "Sounds like a few are still sniffing around." She leaned against the wagon wheel. "They didn't seem like they were looking for cards. I'll speak to the sheriff. He's got no love for men like that. He said you'd be easy to spot, tall, quiet, and too clean to be a drifter." Vance gave a short breath through his nose. "Then he remembers me." She looked toward the hills beyond the barn, where the shadows had started to stretch. "You think they'll come here? If they do, they'll find more than they bargained for." She stepped closer to him, her voice low. "I won't run again, but I want a rifle near the door. You'll have it," he said. That evening, Ruth sat cross-legged on the porch, a rifle across her lap, oiling the action with the kind of care most folks reserved for prayer books. Vance brought her a cup of coffee and sat beside her. "You ever think about what you want to build here?" he asked. "Not just keep safe, but make." She kept polishing, her movements slow. "A place where the past doesn't knock every time the wind shifts. A house where the doors open because someone's home, not because someone's looking to take." He turned the cup in his hands. "I've got lumber enough for another room, thought about adding on before winter." She glanced at him. "You planning for someone else to fill it?" He met her eyes. "I'm planning for you, and whatever comes after." She set the rifle down gently and folded her arms around her knees. "I thought if I ever settled, it'd be because I had no other road left, but this feels like something I chose." "You did," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Then build the room, I'll make the curtains." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wild iris from the ridge. The porch boards creaked beneath their weight, but neither moved. The rifle lay forgotten beside them. Inside, the lamp burned low, casting gold against the window glass. Outside, the land stretched quiet and wide, holding its breath for the life they were beginning to shape. And for the first time in either of their memories, there was nothing missing. The hammering began at first light. Vance worked with measured strokes, setting the frame for the new room just off the kitchen wall. Ruth stood barefoot on the porch for a long while, arms crossed, watching the shape of it rise. The air smelled of sawdust and warmed earth. By midday, she joined him, holding a bucket of nails and a rolled bundle of muslin she'd marked with charcoal lines. "If the window fits the north side," she said, brushing her hair back with the crook of her arm, "we'll get morning sun straight through. I can stitch the cloth into panels before the first frost." Vance tapped the nail flush and looked over. "You picking where the light falls now? I figure if I'm staying, I ought to see the sun when I wake." He nodded once, then handed her the level. "Tell me if I'm off." She knelt beside him, checking the beam. "Hold steady," she said. "You're leaning east." By the end of the week, the room stood firm, its walls bare pine, the scent of it still sharp and clean. Vance sanded the windowsills while Ruth washed the floorboards with vinegar and water, her sleeves tied up with twine to her shoulders. When the final board was nailed in place, they stood in the doorway together, neither speaking. The next day, they rode out past the East Ridge with a borrowed wagon from the neighbor's farm. Their destination, a small abandoned homestead Ruth had remembered from her ride into town. It sat empty, the roof half caved, but the furniture inside remained upright if weathered. They worked in silence, hauling a bed frame and a rocker, a small side table with a cracked leg. Ruth ran her fingers over the carvings on the table's edge. "My father made one like this," she said. "He never finished the scrollwork, said he'd come back to it when the war ended." "Did he?" "No. But I think about him every time I see a wood knot shaped like a thumbprint." They brought the pieces home, sanded them clean, and set them in the new room. That night, they slept there for the first time, the window cracked just enough to let in the crickets. Come June, the sheriff from Dry Creek rode out to the ranch. Ruth was hanging laundry when she spotted his shape against the road, and she wiped her hands on her skirt before stepping off the porch. "Morning, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "I came to speak with Vance." Vance stepped out from the barn, wiping grit from his palms. Something stirred, the sheriff dismounted. "Clay Redden's boys tried to stir up trouble in town. One of them came in asking about you, words they were planning a fire. I've got them in lockup now and they won't be leaving it soon." Ruth narrowed her eyes. "That all of them? Far as we can tell, judges coming in from Helena next week. Reckon they'll be tried quick." Vance nodded. "You've done more than I expected," the sheriff shrugged. "You kept your head down." "That counts for something." After he rode off, Ruth walked back toward the line where the linens hung, her steps slow. "It's done then?" she asked. Vance picked up the wicker basket beside her. "It's over." She didn't answer. She reached out instead, rested her hand on the back of his neck, and pulled him into a kiss that tasted of linen soap and sun-warmed skin. Later that evening, they sat on the porch with their supper, watching the light fade across the hills. She peeled an apple with her knife, the skin curling in one long red ribbon. "There's something I'd like to ask," she said, not looking up. "Do you want children?" He didn't answer right away. He set down his fork and leaned forward, elbows on knees. "I've thought about it," he said. "Didn't seem right before, too much unsettled. And now," he reached over, took the curl of apple skin from her lap and set it on the railing. "Now I think there's room if you do." She turned to face him, her eyes calm. "I do." That night they walked the pasture barefoot, the grass cool and soft beneath their soles. Ruth stopped beneath the cottonwood and pressed her palm to his chest. "You gave me more than safety," she said. "You gave me a life I didn't know I could want." He rested his forehead against hers. "You gave me a reason to build again." They undressed in the dark, the open window letting in the night wind. Their hands moved slow, reverent. That night they didn't speak. They didn't need to. The following spring, Ruth stood in the doorway of the new room, one hand on the round swell of her belly. Vance was in the garden, planting turnips beneath the warming earth. She watched him for a long moment before calling out, "You missed a row." He looked up and grinned, wiping his brow. "Then come show me where." She did. She walked barefoot across the grass, her dress caught in the breeze, one hand steady on her side. When she reached him, she pressed her fingers to the soil, then to his. Later, they named the baby Elias. He was born on the first warm morning in April, before the bluebells bloomed. Ruth labored in the quiet, with Vance at her side and the midwife from town sitting silent by the stove. When it was done, she held the boy against her chest and wept without shame. Vance built a cradle from leftover pine and carved her father's thumbprint into the leg. They raised Elias with the same quiet steadiness that had first built their love. He grew strong, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's quiet watchfulness. Ruth taught him to ride. Vance taught him to plant straight rows. Together, they grew old in the house with the north-facing window and the room they built themselves. They never locked the door. They never needed to.